Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. David tapped his fingers against the polished oak of the dining table, the weight of Emily's words still echoing in his ears. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, though it did little to dull the sharp edge of her request. "I just need closure," she had said, her tone a mix of sincerity and something he couldn't quite place. "Mark and we never got a real goodbye." Closure. David mulled the word over like a bitter pill. 15 years of love and trust, and yet here she sat, asking for permission to meet with her ex-boyfriend. Her eyes, typically a beacon of warmth, darted away from his now, unable to hold his gaze for long. "It's not what you think," Emily added quickly, sensing the tension. "It's just something I need to move forward. For us." David leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying her face. This was the woman he had built his life with. The woman who laughed at his worst jokes, who stayed up with him during sleepless nights of work stress, and who had once promised him forever. But now, that bond felt frayed, like a rope pulled too tight for too long. He cleared his throat, his voice calm but firm. "Emily, do you realize what you're asking me? You're telling me you need to reopen something with him, to close it with me." "It's not like that." Her voice rose, defensive. "It's not about choosing him over you. It's about ending that chapter properly." David shook his head slowly, the familiar ache of betrayal creeping into his chest. He had heard the stories, seen relationships crumble around him over less. But he also knew himself, knew he wouldn't lash out, wouldn't beg. He had always believed in mutual respect, and yet this request felt like a crack in that foundation. "I'm asking for is a little time," Emily said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Please, David. Trust me." Her touch was warm, but it didn't reach him. Instead, it sparked a quiet resolution in his heart. "Fine," he said, finally, his voice betraying none of the turmoil within. "Do what you need to do." Emily exhaled in relief, mistaking his calm for understanding. She leaned in and kissed his cheek, her gratitude palpable. "Thank you, David. I knew you'd understand." But David always saw the goal of his mission. But David wasn't sure he did. And as the days passed, he realized her request wasn't just a test of their marriage, it was a crossroads. One where he had to decide whether to wait for her to return or to prepare for the possibility that she wouldn't. By the time Emily left to meet Mark, David had already begun to make his own plans. While she pursued closure, he would pursue clarity. The front door clicked shut behind Emily, leaving the house eerily quiet. David stood motionless in the entryway, listening to the faint hum of her car engine fading into the distance. His heart ached with the weight of her departure, but his mind had already moved into a different gear. He stepped into the living room and sank onto the couch, staring at the blank television screen. The hollow emptiness in the room matched the gnawing void inside him. How had it come to this? For years, he'd worked tirelessly to ensure their life together was stable, comfortable, even joyful. Yet here he was, left to wonder whether any of it had been enough. David wasn't one to wallow, though. He knew himself too well for that. After a few minutes of stillness, he pushed himself to his feet and headed for the study. It was time to take action, not in anger, but in calculated preparation. He'd seen too many people react impulsively, letting emotion dictate their choices. That wasn't his way. The study smelled faintly of old books and cedar, a comforting scent that seemed to steady him. David pulled out a leather-bound notebook from the top drawer of the desk, flipping to a blank page. This wasn't the first time he had jotted down plans for the future, but this time the stakes felt higher. He titled the page Plan B. The first item on the list was simple but profound: secure independence. If Emily came back, he wanted to be in a position of strength, not vulnerability. If she didn't, he refused to be left scrambling. He began listing out tasks with meticulous care. Separate finances, find a new apartment, quiet, central, near work, graft an exit plan. Each line felt like a step toward reclaiming control, a lifeline pulling him out of the sinking ship their marriage seemed to be becoming. David paused for a moment, tapping his pen against the notebook. His mind drifted to memories of happier times. Lazy Sunday mornings spent laughing in this very room, planning trips they never took but always dreamed of. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago, yet they also reminded him of who he used to be. A man with dreams of his own, long before he tied his life to Emily's. Somewhere along the way, he'd let those dreams fade, replaced by a devotion that now seemed so far away. By the time he finished writing, the notebook was filled with practical to-dos, interspersed with more personal goals. Things like revisit hobbies and reconnect with old friends. He resolved that no matter how the situation unfolded, he wouldn't lose himself in the process. With the framework of a plan in place, David turned his attention to the house. The stillness now felt oppressive, so he busied himself with small tasks. He started packing up a few personal belongings, not in haste, but with quiet intention. A box for books, another for old photos, and a third for sentimental items. Reminders of the man he had been before this relationship. As he worked, his thoughts wandered back to Emily. Was she sitting across from Mark right now, rehashing old memories and sharing secrets that should have been reserved for their marriage? The thought stung, but David forced himself to refocus. He wouldn't let speculation derail him. Later, as evening shadows crept into the room, David took a break and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He sat by the window, watching the world outside carry on as if his life hadn't just taken a seismic shift. Couples strolled past on the sidewalk, laughing and holding hands, oblivious to the storm brewing inside his heart. David sipped the amber liquid, letting its warmth steady him. He reminded himself that strength wasn't about denying pain. It was about moving through it, bit by bit, until it no longer had power over you. By the time night fell, David had packed several boxes, sent inquiries to a few apartment listings, and even drafted an email to a lawyer a friend had recommended. He wasn't certain he'd need any of it, but having the pieces in place gave him a sense of calm he hadn't felt in days. As he climbed into bed that night, the silence no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like possibility. like the first breath of air after holding it underwater for too long. And for the first time in weeks, David fell asleep with a sense of purpose. David woke early, the faint glow of dawn filtering through the curtains. Sleep had been surprisingly restful, though the events of the previous day still loomed large in his mind. As he moved through the quiet house, its emptiness seemed magnified. The absence of Emily was palpable, but instead of despair, it brought clarity. Today, he would set his plans into motion. After a quick breakfast, David returned to the study, where his notebook lay open on the desk. The pages were filled with lists and ideas, all scrawled in his precise handwriting. He added a new item to the list: reclaim your story. It wasn't just about moving forward. It was about redefining his life on his own terms. David logged into their shared bank accounts and began reviewing transactions. There weren't any immediate signs of impropriety, but he wasn't taking any chances. Years of merging finances meant that untangling them would be tedious but necessary. He made a note to contact the bank about opening a separate account later in the day. Next, he searched for apartments. He didn't want to make any hasty decisions, so he focused on temporary solutions, places that were clean, simple, and private. A few listings caught his eye, and he sent inquiries to landlords. He imagined what it would feel like to start fresh in a space that was entirely his own. The idea gave him a sense of lightness, like a burden lifting off his shoulders. After handling these practical tasks, David took a moment to reflect. He stepped out onto the patio, coffee in hand, and let the cool morning air wash over him. The garden Emily had so lovingly tended lay quiet, the flowers bending slightly in the breeze. It had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could escape and find peace. He wondered if Mark had been part of her thoughts as she worked here. And they let the cool morning air wash over him. The thought stung, but David pushed it aside. This wasn't about Emily anymore. It was about him. As the morning stretched on, David decided to take a walk. The rhythm of his steps was steady and purposeful, matching his mood. He found himself wandering through the nearby park, where couples and families filled the paths. He noticed a man tossing a frisbee to his dog, and a mother guiding her toddler along the swings. The scenes of normalcy struck a chord with him. Life went on, even in the face of personal upheaval. David's phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from an old friend, Matt, whom he hadn't seen in years. They'd fallen out of touch as life got busier, but Matt had recently reached out, expressing interest in catching up. David hesitated, unsure if he was ready to explain his current situation. But then he remembered his promise to himself: reconnect with old friends. He typed a quick response, agreeing to meet for coffee later in the week. Returning home, David felt invigorated. He realized how much of his identity had become tied to his relationship with Emily. Reconnecting with Matt was a small but important step toward rediscovering the person he'd been before marriage. A person with dreams, interests, and relationships that didn't revolve around someone else. The afternoon brought another task: clearing out the guest bedroom. It had long been a catch-all for old furniture, forgotten hobbies, and things neither he nor Emily had used in years. As David sorted through the clutter, he stumbled upon a box of his old journals. Flipping through the pages, he was struck by how optimistic and curious he had been in his 20s. There were entries about traveling, learning new skills, and building a fulfilling life. Somewhere along the way, those aspirations had taken a back seat. David vowed to revisit those dreams, even if it meant starting small. Among the clutter, he also found a box of Emily's keepsakes, old letters, photos, and trinkets from her past. For a moment, he debated whether to look through them. Curiosity tugged at him, but he ultimately decided against it. Whatever those items represented, they were hers to deal with, not his. He placed the box neatly to the side, a symbolic act of letting go. As the sun dipped below the horizon, David treated himself to a quiet dinner. He had always enjoyed cooking, though it had been a shared activity with Emily for most of their marriage. Tonight, he decided to cook for himself alone. The act felt oddly liberating. He prepared a simple meal, grilled salmon with asparagus, and a glass of wine, and ate at the dining table, savoring the quiet. After dinner, David turned his attention to his final task of the day. He opened his laptop and began drafting a letter. It wasn't a letter he intended to send. Rather, it was for himself, a way to articulate everything he'd been feeling. He wrote about his disappointment and pain, but also about his hopes and plans. By the time he finished, the page was filled with raw honesty, and he felt a sense of catharsis. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in his desk drawer, a reminder of this pivotal moment in his life. As night fell, David stood in the doorway of the study, looking at the room one last time before turning off the light. He felt tired, but calm, like a man who had faced the worst and come out the other side. Emily might still return with her explanations and promises, but David knew that whatever happened, he was ready. He had begun building something new, something unshakable, a life rooted in self-respect and purpose. The familiar hum of Emily's car pulled into the driveway late in the evening. David heard the engine stop and the sound of the car door closing. He sat in the living room, the low glow of a table lamp casting soft shadows across the room. His heart pounded, not from nervousness, but from a simmering sense of resolve. He didn't rise to greet her, nor did he pretend to be engrossed in something else. He simply waited, his hands folded in his lap, his expression neutral. Moments later, the front door creaked open, and Emily stepped inside. "David." Her voice carried a tentative edge, as though she wasn't sure how to navigate the silence that greeted her. "I'm here," David replied evenly. Emily stepped into the living room, her face shadowed, but her posture tense. She looked at him, as if searching for an indication of what he was thinking. For the first time in their marriage, David realized the balance of power had shifted. He wasn't waiting for answers. He already had them. It was Emily who now seemed unsure. "How was your evening?" he asked, his tone polite, but devoid of warmth. Emily hesitated, her coat still draped over one arm. It was fine. I met with Mark. We talked." She set her bag down on the chair, but her movements were uncharacteristically clumsy, betraying her unease. David nodded slowly, letting the silence linger. He didn't press her, didn't fill the space with questions. He wanted her to speak, not out of obligation, but because she chose to. Emily finally sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It was good," she began. "I mean, it was what I needed. Closure, you know?" Her voice wavered slightly. "We said our goodbyes, and I feel like I can finally move forward now." David studied her, his expression unreadable. "Good. I'm glad you got what you needed." His calmness seemed to unsettle her, as if she had been bracing for anger or accusations. "David, I know this was hard for you," Emily said, her eyes pleading, "but I want you to know that it's over now. Mark and I, we're completely in the past." "Are you sure about that?" David's question was simple, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Emily flinched slightly, her composure slipping. "Of course I'm sure," she replied quickly. "Why would you ask that?" David leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Because you asked me to trust you, Emily. To give you the space to meet with someone who once held a part of your heart. And I did. But trust is a fragile thing, isn't it? Once it's tested like this, it doesn't just snap back into place." "I know," she stammered. "And I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust, David. I promise." He leaned back again, folding his arms across his chest. "That's good to hear, because while you were finding your closure, I was finding mine." Emily's face registered confusion, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" David's voice remained calm, but his words cut with precision. "While you were out connecting with Mark, I was thinking about what I need, what I deserve. And I realized something, Emily. I've spent so much of our marriage bending, compromising, and putting your needs above my own. But now I've decided to prioritize myself for once." Emily's lips parted, as though she wanted to protest, but no words came out. David continued. "I started preparing for the possibility that your need for closure was more than just a one-time conversation. I packed some of my things, looked into separate accounts, and even contacted a lawyer to explore my options." Her eyes widened. "A lawyer? David, I thought we were trying to fix this." "Well, David asked pointedly, "because from where I'm sitting I was trying to fix it. You were trying to decide if our marriage was enough for you." "That's not fair," Emily snapped, her voice rising. "I told you why I needed to do this. It wasn't about leaving you. It was about moving on from him." "And yet you had to leave me behind to do it," David replied, his tone never shifting. "Do you see how that might make me question where I stand in your life?" Emily pressed her palms to her temples, her frustration palpable. "David, I made a mistake. I see that now. I should have handled things differently, but I swear to you, I want us to work." David's eyes softened slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. "Maybe you do, Emily, but trust isn't rebuilt with words. It's rebuilt with actions. And right now, I need to see if I can even trust myself to stay in this marriage." Emily blinked, tears welling in her eyes. "Are you saying you want to leave?" David sighed, the weight of his emotions evident. "I'm saying I need time, Emily. just like you needed time to figure out what you wanted. I need time to figure out what you wanted. I need time to figure out what I need. You told me to trust you, and I did. Now, I need to learn to trust myself again." The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken words. Emily nodded slowly, the tears spilling over her cheeks. "I'll give you whatever space you need, David," she whispered. The house sat silent. A dark night. He stood, towering over her as she looked up at him. "Good, because from here on out, Emily, I'm not waiting for you to decide where you stand. I'm deciding where I stand." As he walked upstairs to the guest room, Emily remained in her seat, staring at the empty space where he'd been. For the first time, she truly understood what was at stake, and that this time she might not be able to fix it. The days that followed Emily's return were a blur of heavy silences and tentative conversations. Emily made attempts to bridge the gap between them, offering apologies, expressing regret, promising that she had learned from the past. Yet, David's actions remained unchanged. He continued with his daily routine, his outward calm a stark contrast to the storm of emotions quietly roiling inside him. But David wasn't in a rush to make any decisions. The quiet days, though laced with tension, gave him time to reflect, to assess, and to reconnect with the person he had once been. Before his world had been reshaped by Emily's betrayal, he spent more time in the garden that Emily had nurtured for years. The once bustling space, filled with their shared dreams of a life together, now felt like a place to escape, to find clarity in the simple act of tending to the flowers and plants she had cultivated. As he trimmed the bushes, pulled weeds from the soil, and rearranged pots, David thought about the delicate balance of relationships. He realized that trust, much like the garden, required care, patience, and consistent effort. Once uprooted, it could take time to grow back. By the end of the week, David had made an important decision. The time for merely existing in the limbo of indecision had passed. He wasn't sure if Emily could ever regain his trust or if their marriage could ever go back to what it had been. But he knew that he couldn't live in uncertainty any longer. He needed closure for himself. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, David sat down at the kitchen table with a pen and paper. He began writing, but not to Emily. He wrote to himself. The letter was a personal reflection, a statement of his intentions moving forward. It was filled with thoughts about reclaiming his independence, rediscovering his passions, and living a life that didn't depend on the validation or choices of others. He wrote about his need for self-respect, his desire for a fresh start, and the understanding that this was not about anger, but about choosing a healthier future. David paused for a moment after finishing the letter, running his fingers over the paper. He folded it neatly, placing it in the drawer of the desk. It was a quiet declaration of freedom, not from Emily, but from the expectations that had weighed him down for so long. As the week passed, Emily continued to show remorse, but David's distance had hardened into something more resolute. She would apologize, but his responses remained measured, never promising more than the possibility of reconciliation. He had stopped seeing himself as her husband, and instead began to see himself as a man who needed to rediscover his own voice, his own path. The turning point came when David decided to take a short trip away, alone. He had booked a small cabin in the mountains, far enough from home to clear his head and close enough to stay in touch if anything urgent arose. Emily didn't ask questions when he told her. She was still processing the weight of his withdrawal and understood that space was something he needed. In the quiet solitude of the cabin, David spent his days hiking the nearby trails, his mind unwinding with every step. The fresh air seemed to sweep away the remnants of his old life, the one filled with doubt and mistrust. He cooked simple meals for himself, read books he hadn't touched in years, and even sketched the landscapes that unfolded before him. It was a return to basics, to the things he had loved before his life had been entangled with the complexities of marriage. As the days passed, a deep sense of calm settled over David. He realized that regardless of what happened with Emily, he was capable of building a life that didn't revolve around the expectations of others. This was the first time in a long while that he truly felt his own strength, unshackled from the weight of the past. When David returned, there was no dramatic confrontation, no sweeping reconciliation. Instead, Emily greeted him quietly at the door. Her expression was softer, more resigned, and David could see the change in her eyes. Perhaps, for the first time, she understood the depth of the loss, not just of their relationship, but of the trust she had broken. "I've been thinking," Emily began, her voice subdued, "about everything. And I know I've hurt you. I wish I could change that." David looked at her, his gaze steady, but not unkind. "I know you do, Emily," he said simply. "But I've also come to realize something. I can't wait for you to fix me. I have to fix myself first. I have to be okay regardless of what happens between us." Her eyes welled with tears, but she nodded in understanding. There was no more pleading, no more promises of change. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had both begun. One that didn't necessarily mean they would walk it together. In the days that followed, Emily made her own choices. She sought counseling, not to repair the marriage, but to understand her own actions and what had led her to this point. It was the first time in years that she focused solely on her own healing, a step that David had silently hoped for all along. David, for his part, threw himself into the things he had rediscovered in the mountains. His passion for art, his love of hiking, his need for independence. He called up old friends, made plans to travel, and began setting new goals for himself. The future, once clouded with uncertainty, now felt like a vast expanse of possibility. And as weeks turned into months, David's life slowly transformed. He learnt to appreciate the quiet moments. Those moments when he was simply himself, free from the weight of unspoken expectations. The man who had once been defined by his relationship with Emily was now defined by his own choices, his own ambitions, and the strength to move forward, whatever lay ahead. One day, as David stood in front of a canvas, paintbrush in hand, he realized he was no longer waiting for an answer from Emily. He had given himself the closure he needed, and in doing so, had set himself free. And with that freedom, David understood. The chapter wasn't just over, it was the beginning of something new.